On June 22, 1940, Adolf Hitler sat down inside a railway dining car parked in a forest clearing outside the French town of Compiegne to accept the surrender of France. It was the same railway car, moved back to the exact same spot in the same clearing in which Germany itself had signed the armistice, ending the First World War 22 years earlier. A piece of calculated historical theater Hitler had spent months looking forward to arranging. Hitler had ordered the car removed from the museum building where it had been preserved specifically so France could surrender inside the same four walls where Germany's own defeat had once been dictated to it, turning a French national memorial into the stage for its own most humiliating moment. The war that ended with that calculated act of revenge had begun barely 6 weeks earlier, on May 10th, against a French army that possessed more tanks, comparable numbers of men, and a border fortified with some of the most expensive defensive works ever constructed by any nation in peacetime. France lost anyway, completely, in less time than it takes most modern military campaigns simply to establish their own supply lines and settle into anything resembling a stable front. This is the story of how Germany defeated France in 6 weeks, a campaign built on a single audacious gamble, 3 separate armies moving in 3 different directions, and a French high command that spent the entire war one full step behind an enemy who had already decided, months in advance, exactly how the whole disaster would unfold on the ground. Every week, we take apart a moment when a war turned, the people who made it happen, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. The German plan that made the 6-week collapse possible was not the plan German commanders had originally intended to use at all, and its own path to approval was almost as improbable as the campaign it eventually produced. The original invasion scheme, drawn up under the Army's Chief of Staff, Franz Halder, called for a fairly conventional advance through Belgium, broadly similar in concept to Germany's own opening moves in the First World War, an approach French and British planners had specifically prepared for by moving their own best divisions north into Belgium the moment German forces crossed the border, exactly the response the original German plan would have played directly into. A revised plan, associated with the staff officer Erich von Manstein and eventually approved by Hitler personally in February of 1940, after a German aircraft carrying details of the earlier plan crashed in Belgium and forced a rethink, proposed something considerably bolder instead, using the advance into the Netherlands and Belgium as a deliberate decoy to draw the best Allied divisions north, while the real weight of the German attack drove through the Ardennes forest further south, terrain French commanders had confidently assessed as effectively impassable to any large armored force moving at speed. 3 separate German army groups executed that plan simultaneously, each with its own distinct role in the wider deception, a level of coordination between deliberately unequal forces that French planning had never seriously anticipated having to counter. Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, a commander this channel has already covered in detail for his later role leading the drive on Moscow, struck into the Netherlands and Belgium exactly as French planners expected, deliberately drawing the British Expeditionary Force and the best divisions of the French Army North to meet what appeared, for the first several days of the campaign, to be the main German thrust rather than the diversion it actually was. Army Group A, considerably stronger in armor and commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, delivered the actual decisive blow, driving 7 Panzer divisions through the Ardennes and toward the Meuse River, a force that included General Heinz Guderian's own armored corps and the 7th Panzer Division under Erwin Rommel, a division this channel has already told the story of in its own right, a unit that advanced so fast during the opening days of the campaign that it briefly outran even the German army's own ability to track its position on a map back in Berlin. Before we get into how quickly that plan actually collapsed the French defense, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The irony of the entire campaign centered on a piece of infrastructure that barely factored into the actual fighting at all. France had spent the better part of a decade and a substantial share of its own defense budget constructing the Maginot Line, a heavily fortified string of bunkers, artillery positions, and underground galleries running along the German border, built specifically to prevent the kind of direct frontal assault that had cost France so dearly in the First World War. The line itself performed exactly as designed, and German planners had no serious intention of ever attacking it directly, choosing instead to simply go around its northern end through Belgium and the supposedly impassable Ardennes rather than test its defenses head-on. French garrisons manning the Maginot Line's own fortifications spent much of the 6-week campaign fighting nobody at all, isolated from a war that had already been decided hundreds of miles to their north and did not formally surrender until June the 29th, a full week after the armistice negotiations at Compiegne had already concluded, defending a fortress line that had never actually been called upon to stop the invasion its entire construction had been justified around preventing. The German gamble paid off within days rather than weeks, faster than even its own planners had confidently predicted it might. 7 Panzer divisions reached the Meuse River at Dinant by May the 12th, just 2 days after the invasion began, and French commanders, having sent their own best mobile forces north to meet the decoy attack in Belgium, found themselves defending the supposedly impassable Ardennes sector with considerably weaker, less mobile reserves than the rest of the front actually possessed, a gap in coverage the German plan had been built specifically to exploit from the very first day. By May the 13th, the French government itself was already making preparations to abandon Paris, a panic that arrived barely 3 days into a war French planning had assumed would unfold slowly enough to allow a considered methodical response rather than the improvised scramble it actually produced. German panzer divisions, once across the Meuse, did not pause to consolidate their gains the way conventional military doctrine of the era generally recommended, instead driving directly for the English Channel coast, splitting the Allied armies in the north, the British Expeditionary Force, and the best French divisions from the rest of France entirely within a matter of days, rather than the weeks any pre-war planner on either side would have assumed such a maneuver required. The northern portion of the German plan achieved its own separate, brutal success well before the decisive fighting further south had even reached its climax. The Netherlands, invaded on the same morning as the wider campaign began, surrendered within 5 days, a capitulation hastened dramatically by the German bombing of Rotterdam on May the 14th, an air raid that killed hundreds of civilians and destroyed much of the city's historic center, delivered specifically to convince Dutch commanders that continued resistance would only bring similar devastation to every other Dutch city in turn. Belgium held out longer, its own army fighting alongside French and British forces further north, but surrendered on May the 28th as the wider Allied position in the north collapsed entirely following the German breakthrough further south, one more piece of the original decoy attack achieving a decisive result of its own, even though the actual weight of German strategic attention had already moved elsewhere by that point in the campaign. That encirclement produced the campaign's most famous single episode, the evacuation of the trapped Allied armies from the port of Dunkirk, a rescue operation improvised under enormous pressure once the scale of the encirclement became fully apparent to British commanders. Winston Churchill authorized Operation Dynamo, a hurriedly organized evacuation effort this channel has already covered from the perspective of the admiral who ran it, and between May the 27th and June the 4th, a fleet of naval vessels and civilian boats, everything from Royal Navy destroyers to small privately owned fishing boats requisitioned for the crossing, carried 338,226 Allied soldiers back across the Channel to England, roughly 140,000 of them French troops evacuated, alongside their British allies rather than left to face capture on the beaches. Every one of those men escaped without the heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, and vehicles they had brought to France, equipment abandoned on the beaches and in the surrounding countryside that the French army fighting on further south would desperately need in the weeks that followed and would never actually get back in any meaningful quantity before the campaign's own final collapse. With the Northern Allied armies evacuated or destroyed, German forces turned south against a French army that had already lost its best mobile divisions and much of its heavy equipment in the campaign's opening 2 weeks, a force fighting on with fewer resources than it had possessed at any earlier point in its own history, and with morale collapsing visibly at every level of command. General Maxime Weygand, the French Supreme Commander, who had replaced the previous commander-in-chief in the campaign's opening days, specifically because the political leadership had already lost confidence in the original plan, attempted to organize a new defensive line along the Somme and Aisne rivers, an improvised position soldiers and historians afterward came to call the Weygand Line. But the French army, by early June, simply lacked the reserves, the equipment, and increasingly the morale to hold a coherent front against an enemy that had already demonstrated conclusively and repeatedly that it could move faster than French command could actually respond to at any level of the chain of command. German forces entered Paris on June the 14th, unopposed, the French government having already declared the capital an open city rather than subject it to the kind of destructive urban defense that might have slowed the German advance at a catastrophic cost to the city itself and its civilian population. 2 days later, Premier Paul Reynaud resigned rather than preside over the surrender he now considered inevitable, regardless of anything further resistance might accomplish, replaced by the aging Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of the First World War who requested armistice terms from Germany almost immediately after taking office, ending any remaining possibility of continued organized French resistance on the mainland itself. Hitler's own choice of location for the surrender negotiations carried a message considerably more pointed than any battlefield victory alone could have delivered to the watching world. The armistice was signed at Compiegne, specifically because that same forest clearing had been developed in the 2 decades since the previous war into a memorial celebrating France's own 1918 victory over Germany, complete with a statue of French Marshal Ferdinand Foch and monuments to French dead from the earlier conflict that Germany had lost so decisively. Hitler had the original railway car, preserved in a museum building since the end of the First World War, physically moved back to the exact spot it had occupied when Foch dictated surrender terms to a defeated Germany in 1918, down to the same clearing, the same statue standing watch, and the same general layout of the surrounding memorial grounds. American journalist William Shirer, present at the signing and standing barely 50 yards away, described Hitler's own expression in that moment as afire with scorn, anger, hate, revenge, and triumph all at once, a face that had waited more than 2 decades for precisely this specific engineered reversal of fortune. The armistice, signed on June the 22nd and taking effect 3 days later, divided France into a German-occupied northern zone and a nominally independent southern territory governed from the town of Vichy, ending organized French resistance almost exactly 6 weeks after the campaign had begun on a border nobody involved had expected to collapse so completely or so quickly. This is not a story about German tanks simply overwhelming French tanks through some straightforward advantage in numbers or armor, since the two armies possess genuinely comparable equipment and, in several important categories, France actually held the numerical edge going into the campaign on paper. More tanks in total and artillery pieces that matched or exceeded German numbers in several key categories, German propaganda afterward preferred not to dwell on. It is a story about 3 armies moving according to a single deceptive plan against a defense still organized around the assumptions of the previous war, a French high command that spent the campaign's opening decisive days responding to where German forces appeared to be rather than where the actual weight of the attack had already gone, and a defeat so total and so rapid that the nation on the losing end never fully regained its own military footing before the surrender terms were already being negotiated in a railway car chosen specifically to make the humiliation as complete as the defeat itself had already been on the battlefield. France would not be free of German occupation for 4 more years, and the same Panzer divisions that had crossed the Meuse in a matter of days in 1940 would go on to fight in nearly every subsequent major campaign of the war, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen approaches to Moscow, carrying the same doctrine of speed and deliberate deception that had turned a fortified, well-equipped nation into an occupied territory in less time than it takes most armies simply to complete their own initial deployment and settle into anything resembling a stable, defensible front line. General Charles de Gaulle, a relatively junior French officer who had commanded one of the few French armored counterattacks to achieve any real success during the campaign's opening days, escaped to London before the armistice was signed and began broadcasting appeals for continued French resistance from exile, the small, distant beginning of a free French movement that would eventually return to a liberated Paris 4 years later, marching down streets German soldiers had occupied, unopposed on a June afternoon in 1940 that nobody involved on either side had expected to arrive quite so quickly. If you want more stories about the campaigns decided before the first shot was even fired, subscribe and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.